Have you ever heard of Typhon, the monster so powerful that it almost destroyed the gods of Olympus themselves? Imagine a being so immense, so destructive, that even Zeus, the king of the gods, couldn't face him alone. Today, we're going to reveal the true story of Typhon, from his birth in the depths of the underworld to the epic battle that shook the world of the gods. But here's a warning: what you're about to hear is far more than just a simple legend. Get ready to discover secrets that even the gods themselves tried to hide. What happened when Gaia, furious with the betrayal of the gods, unleashed the most feared monster of all time? You'll be shocked by what comes next. Stay tuned, because the story of Typhon is going to challenge everything you think you know about Greek mythology. Don't miss what's coming. Gaia, the earth, felt a pain so deep that it seemed to corrode her very roots. After the fall of the Titans, she believed the gods of Olympus, now victorious, would be grateful for her help in the war. But instead of recognition, she was betrayed. Her children, the Titans, were cast into the depths of the underworld, imprisoned and forgotten, while the gods glorified themselves atop Olympus. Gaia, who had given life to the world, felt as though she had been discarded, abandoned by her own children, who were now being tortured in the dark. Every time a thunderclap echoed in the sky, Gaia felt an even sharper pain, as if Zeus himself were mocking her loss. And resentment grew inside her, stronger than any physical pain. Revenge became inevitable, something she could no longer contain. She could not accept that Zeus and the other gods would live their lives in peace while her children languished in the depths of the world. Something had to be done. Gaia knew she couldn't do this alone. She needed an ally, someone as powerful as the gods themselves. Her gaze then turned to the deepest shadows of the underworld, where pain and darkness reigned. There, in the heart of chaos, she knew her brother Tartarus, the god of the underworld, could help her. Tartarus, an immense and primal force, felt a rage similar to Gaia's, rage against the gods who had ignored and underestimated him. He was the one who could give Gaia the strength she needed for her revenge. When Gaia sought out Tartarus, he accepted her plea for help without hesitation. He understood all too well what she was feeling. Together, combining Gaia's strength with Tartarus's darkness, they began to shape the most terrifying creature of all, Typhon, a monster capable of shaking the very foundations of Olympus. The earth trembled as the monster took shape, its enormous wings spreading like curtains of shadow, and its eyes burning like fire. Typhon was not just a creature, he was the very embodiment of Gaia's fury and hatred. He grew in the depths, where the sun never touched, where the wounds of the world were deepest. Each day he became stronger, more immense, more unbearable. His strength was beyond any imagination, more powerful than any god could fathom. And so Gaia's revenge was underway. The monster was about to be born, and Olympus would never know what awaited it. When Gaia and Tartarus met, the world seemed to warm with the tension of their alliance. It was a deep bond, intertwined in the very veins of the earth, where Gaia's pain and Tartarus's rage merged into something that could not be ignored. They were siblings, creators of what could destroy Olympus itself. And this union promised to bring something far beyond mere revenge, an indomitable force that could return to Gaia everything she had lost. Tartarus, with his realm of eternal darkness, was the personification of chaos. His domain was not just a physical place, but the very essence of the underworld, where lost souls and forgotten gods were imprisoned. He understood the power of darkness and destruction like no one else, and he knew that this was the only way to respond to the insult the gods had inflicted upon his sister. But what Gaia sought was not just revenge. She wanted something far more terrifying: absolute domination. With Tartarus by her side, the plan would be unbeatable. They began to work in silence, away from the eyes of any god or mortal. Gaia, with her power over the earth, and Tartarus, with his control over the abyss, created a being with the accumulated fury and strength of thousands of years. In the depths of the underworld, where even the winds dared not blow, a monstrous creature began to take shape. It would not be a mere beast, but something that represented chaos, rage, and vengeance personified. The name of this creature would be Typhon. Typhon would not be just a monster, but a being capable of rivaling the gods themselves. He would become the symbol of everything Zeus and the other gods had tried to destroy. The primordial force of nature, the force that came before everything else. With his giant wings, fiery eyes, and a body that twisted like a whirlwind of terror, Typhon would be the purest expression of Gaia's fury and the incarnation of hatred from the underworld. The birth of Typhon was neither simple nor quick. He grew in the shadows, in an environment where sounds were muffled by the darkness itself, where time seemed to lose its meaning. He was fed by Gaia's emotions, by the anger and sadness she held, and by the chaotic energy Tartarus poured into him. Typhon fed on pain, becoming stronger every day as Gaia and Tartarus prepared for the right moment. The moment when he would rise and destroy everything Zeus had built. They knew that Typhon wasn't ready to face Olympus immediately, but every second of his existence made him stronger, more capable of challenging Zeus himself. Gaia watched her monster grow with pride and a growing sense of power. But inside her, something else emerged, an insatiable desire to see the gods in ruins, to see Zeus finally pay for the betrayal he had committed against her and her children. The game had begun, and Olympus was about to be shaken by a force it had never imagined. Destiny was about to change, and Typhon, the monster born from the depths of the earth and the underworld, would be the key to that change. The underworld had never been so disturbed. There, where the souls of the lost wandered in silence, the very air seemed to pulse with a strange and dangerous energy. In the depths, where light never touched, a new form was taking shape, a creature that would carry within itself all of Gaia's pain and vengeance. Typhon began to take shape slowly, like a dark shadow expanding into the void. At first, he was just an indistinguishable mass, but soon he began to define himself, growing in a terrifying way. His skin was like cracked and parched earth, as if it had absorbed all the world's anger. His arms stretched out to infinity, his eyes burned like flames that would never die, and his wings, enormous and dark, covered the horizon of the darkness where he was born. With every breath, the air around him seemed to tremble. Typhon's strength wasn't just physical. He radiated a destructive energy, a feeling that the very universe could collapse under his weight. Gaia watched her monster grow with a mixture of pride and satisfaction. He wasn't just a weapon of revenge, but the manifestation of the fury of the world itself. She knew that when Typhon was ready, he could destroy even the gods. As the days passed, Typhon grew in strength, intelligence, and hatred. His hands, which at first were only massive claws, now moved with threatening skill, as if they knew exactly where to strike to cause the most destruction. His eyes, once fiery and uncontrolled, now became focused, glowing with a clear purpose: to destroy everything related to the gods of Olympus. And as he grew, the world began to feel the impact of his existence. The ground trembled every time he moved, as if the very foundations of the planet were being shaken. The sky began to darken when he took deep breaths, as if his presence alone was enough to block out the sunlight. Even the seas stirred, as if they knew that a new power was about to emerge. But Typhon was not just a creature of destruction without control. On the contrary, he possessed deadly cunning. His mind, shaped by the darkness of the underworld and the chaos surrounding him, quickly began to grow more strategic. He knew he shouldn't strike yet. He understood that the right moment would come. And when he finally emerged, it would be the end for Zeus and all the gods of Mount Olympus. In the depths where he grew, Gaia and Tartarus were discussing the next steps. The plan was about to be set in motion, and Typhon's power was the key to overthrowing Olympus. Typhon, now ready to leave his home in the underworld and confront the gods, represented Gaia's revenge and the chaos she had envisioned in her mind. Typhon's birth was not just the beginning of a new threat. It marked the start of a new chapter. In Greek mythology, one that would bring terror, destruction, and an unprecedented challenge to the gods of Olympus. As the days passed, Typhon's transformation reached alarming levels. The creature that Gaia and Tartarus had created was no longer just a colossal monster. He had become a force of nature, unpredictable and uncontrollable. His wings stretched out like curtains of shadows, beating with such force that the echoes of his movements could be heard even at the edges of the world. His hunger for destruction seemed insatiable, and his anger, deep as the abyss of the underworld itself, grew more intense each day. It was impossible to predict what Typhon would do next. As the monster matured, his actions became more erratic. When he finally reached adolescence, the true rebellious nature of Typhon was revealed. He was no longer content with the limitations imposed by the underworld. The earth would tremble whenever he roared, and darkness spread wherever he passed, swallowing everything in his path. Gaia, who had always watched him with dark pride, began to realize that the monster was becoming more than she had imagined. Typhon, who had been created to be her vengeance, was now becoming a threat even to her. The monster, filled with brute strength and a desire for destruction, no longer understood his mother's intentions. He craved freedom, not just to destroy the gods, but to dominate everything he encountered. The chaos in his mind began to manifest, and Gaia knew she had to act quickly before the monster slipped from her control. It was then that Gaia remembered Pontus, the ancient god of the sea, who had been forgotten with the passage of time. Pontus was a powerful being, capable of calming the most turbulent forces of nature. Perhaps he was the key to containing Typhon's uncontrollable power before he destroyed everything. She turned to him, asking for help to control the creature she had created. Pontus, who had always lived on the fringes of the gods' conflicts, hesitated at first. He knew that any intervention at this point could lead to a confrontation with the forces of Olympus. However, Gaia's situation seemed desperate. Typhon's fury was something he could not ignore. He knew that if the creature fully broke free, the world they knew would be lost. Pontus accepted the task, but with one condition. He would need time and complete control over the creature. Thus, Gaia and Pontus formed a temporary alliance. Pontus, with his immense wisdom about the sea and the creatures that inhabited the earth, tried to convince Typhon to submit to his authority. But the monster, in his rebellious phase, did not want to be controlled. He desired something greater than mere destruction. He wanted to rule, and no god could stop him. Typhon rebelled against Pontus. He tried to intimidate him with his deafening roars, sharp claws, and the destructive energy radiating from his body. The battle between control and fury began. Gaia watched with a mix of concern and resignation. She knew she had created a being that was now more than she could handle. The monster was becoming a reflection of her own hatred, uncontrollable and vast, a symbol of the destruction she herself had spawned. In a last-ditch effort, Pontus tried to use the power of the sea to calm Typhon, invoking the depths of the ocean to trap the monster. But Typhon's rebellion was so strong that not even the deepest waters could contain his power. He broke through the chains Pontus had created with ease, tearing the air with his wings and creating winds that devastated everything in his path. The fight was lost. Gaia, seeing that she could no longer control her own monster, realized that the only option was to release Typhon to follow his destiny, a destiny that would bring chaos and destruction to Olympus and the world. With one final glance at the monster, Gaia prepared to give the order that would change everything. Typhon was ready to follow his own path, and this path could no longer be interrupted. Gaia's plan, though still partially under control, was about to be set in motion. The monster was free, more powerful and rebellious than ever. Olympus was now about to face the storm Gaia had created, and nothing could stop it. Typhon's fury had reached a critical point. His roars echoed through the skies, causing the ground to tremble and the clouds to close into a dark and impenetrable curtain. The creature was uncontrollable, and Gaia, increasingly concerned with the course of events, knew she needed to find a way to contain him, or at least direct him toward a specific purpose. But Typhon, with his disturbed and voracious mind, was no longer willing to follow orders. It was then that Gaia, in one last attempt to maintain control over her son, turned to Echidna, a creature equally fearsome and of mythical origin, who lived on the fringes of gods and monsters. Echidna, known for her own monstrosity and cunning, possessed the power to spawn other terrifying beasts. She was, in fact, the mother of several of the most fearsome creatures that the heroes and gods of Olympus feared. Gaia knew that by uniting Typhon and Echidna, she could create an alliance between the two, a strategic union to keep Typhon occupied, and perhaps channel his violence toward a specific goal. Echidna, with her cruel and creative nature, would be able to temper Typhon's ferocity with her own desires for power and destruction. But more importantly, she had the power to generate monsters, and Gaia knew this could be key to what was coming. When Echidna arrived, the scene was stunning. Her eyes were like abysses, and her skin, as dark as night, reflected the flames of Typhon with a red glow. She moved with undeniable authority, her legs serpentine like those of a gigantic snake. There was something mystical about her presence, something that even made Typhon pause for a moment to observe her, as if he recognized deep inside that this creature was a force that could equally ruin everything he knew. Gaia, with her face full of tension, looked at Echidna and explained the plan. She needed Echidna to influence Typhon, to keep him focused on a single goal, and to help transform his uncontrolled rage into a more efficient tool. Echidna, for her part, accepted the challenge with a wild smile. She knew that Typhon, once allied with her, could become even more powerful, and of course this wouldn't just be about helping him. It was an opportunity to spawn even more monsters that could terrorize them all. The union between Typhon and Echidna was immediate, and to everyone's surprise, it was astonishing. Somehow, the monster, who had seemed indifferent to any form of control, began to understand that Echidna was not just another force to be faced, but an equally powerful ally. The two began to unite, not just as a force of brute strength, but as a combination of intelligence and destruction. What emerged from this union was even more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. From the bond between Typhon and Echidna came the most powerful and monstrous beings in mythology, creatures like the Chimera, the Nemean lion, and Cerberus, the feared three-headed dog, began to emerge. Each one had unique characteristics, but all shared one thing. They were formidable, monstrous, and with a single goal: to spread chaos and destruction wherever they went. Typhon, now with the help of Echidna, had become an even more terrifying force, capable of generating and commanding monsters of epic proportions. The battle he would fight against Olympus was about to intensify, not only with his brute strength, but with the hordes of monsters he now commanded. Gaia watched with a mix of satisfaction and apprehension. The plan was unfolding, but she knew the line between control and total chaos was thin. And what would happen afterward? Typhon was more powerful than ever, but at the same time more unpredictable. Now, with Echidna by his side, Typhon was ready to face the gods. The fate of Olympus seemed more uncertain than ever, and the Olympian pantheon would have to prepare for the arrival of a monstrous army, one that would bring absolute chaos with it. The winds had changed, and the omen of a great battle hung in the air. Olympus, which had always been the center of power and order, could feel the signs of an imminent threat. The earth trembled beneath the steps of Typhon and his new allies, monsters born from Echidna, spreading terror wherever they went. The sky seemed overcast, and a cloak of darkness covered the horizon, as if the universe itself was preparing for a great conflict. Gaia, watching the escalation of destruction by her son, knew the moment had arrived. She had patiently waited for this instant, when Typhon's power would finally be enough to challenge the gods of Olympus. Zeus's world was about to be confronted with a threat like never before, and the vengeance Gaia so desired was now at the doorstep. Typhon, now stronger and with his monstrous allies by his side, felt the rage bubbling in his chest. He wanted to destroy Zeus and the other gods, but more than that, he longed for something greater. He wanted to claim the throne of Olympus for himself. His eyes burned with insane fire as he gazed at the horizon, awaiting Gaia's order to begin the attack. Echidna, by his side, knew the battle would be long and difficult, but she was confident. She had already created immortal and terrible children, but Typhon, with his brute strength and ruthless mind, was the true trump card. With him, the gods' forces would be torn apart, and the world of mortals, as well as the gods, would fall under his tyranny. Gaia did not hesitate. She knew that once the war was declared, there would be no turning back. The fate of all beings who inhabited Olympus and beyond depended on the strength of Typhon. She raised her hand, as if summoning the very sky, and declared with a voice that echoed in all directions, "It's time, Typhon. Let Olympus know of our vengeance. Attack!" With Gaia's command, Typhon launched his attack. His wings, like massive blades, sliced through the air with a deafening sound. The sky, already darkened by the storms he had generated, was illuminated by the lightning of his fury. He advanced, with his dragon heads emitting ear-splitting roars, while his monstrous children, created by Echidna, followed behind him, ready to devour everything in their path. Olympus, until now peaceful, began to sense that something was wrong. Tremors started shaking the mountains, and even Mount Olympus, the home of the gods, trembled. The clouds began to close more densely, and the scent of burning spread through the air. The gods looked to the horizon and saw a colossal silhouette, with a grotesque and threatening shape rapidly approaching. Zeus, sitting on his throne, felt the weight of responsibility. He knew the moment of battle was near, but the threat of Typhon was something he had never imagined. Even he, the king of the gods, felt a chill of fear run down his spine. But as always, his courage and duty prevailed. He stood up, his eyes shining with determination. "The war has come, and we cannot escape it," Zeus declared, his voice booming across Olympus. "Prepare yourselves, my children. We are about to face the storm Gaia has brought upon us." The gods, though apprehensive, prepared for the upcoming confrontation. Athena, ever strategic, gathered the other gods and began organizing Olympus's defenses. Apollo, with his bow and arrows, prepared to strike from a distance. Ares, the god of war, sharpened his weapons, eager for the fight. But everyone knew that the true battle would be fought between Typhon and Zeus. The monster was ready to challenge the very lord of Olympus, and this war would undoubtedly be one of the bloodiest and most decisive in the history of the gods. Typhon and his followers were mere steps away from Olympus, and the war was about to begin. The fury of the Titans, Gaia's revenge, and the threat of a monster who surpassed all limits were now a reality that even the gods could not deny. Olympus, which had always stood atop the world, now found itself on the brink of the abyss, and The gods were about to face the greatest challenge of their lives. The earth trembled with every step Typhon took. His colossal, contorted body rose from the depths of the underworld like a dark and threatening shadow, darkening the sky and blocking out the sunlight. His eyes, like burning embers, glowed with uncontrollable hatred, and his dragon heads aligned in various directions, let out roars that sounded like thunder, reverberating through the mountains and seas. Olympus, usually invincible and protected by its altitude and divine power, now felt the weight of Typhon's approach. The wind, filled with ash and smoke, howled like an omen of the end. The appearance of the monster was not only frightening, it was a nightmare incarnate. His limbs slithered with powerful muscles, his scales shimmered under the light of eruptions, and the smell of fire and venom spread through the air. When the gods realized the monster's arrival, a wave of panic spread through the halls of Mount Olympus. Athena, always steady and rational, was the first to take position, her eyes sharpening with the realization that, even for her, the battle would be difficult. However, the true magnitude of the threat was not yet fully visible, as Typhon was. Hidden in the mist he had created himself. The silence before the storm was terrifying. The first signs of his arrival were the tremors, shockwaves that split the ground beneath the gods' feet, as if the very world were cracking in half. The stone pillars supporting Olympus began to crack, and the mountain rivers began to bubble, consumed by thick, foul smoke. Even the tallest trees trembled under the pressure Typhon exerted on the realm. And then, as a harbinger of terror, the first head of Typhon appeared on the horizon, its monstrous form cutting through the darkness, causing all the gods to freeze for a moment. His fiery eyes glowed intensely, reflecting the fury he carried within. He was a creature made to destroy everything in its path, and Olympus seemed to be the perfect target. The silence that followed was drowned out by the sound of a deafening roar. The true extent of Typhon's monstrosity revealed itself with the arrival of his multiple dragon heads, their mouths wide open, releasing bursts of fire and venom that burned the air around them. The sky above Mount Olympus seemed like a canvas beginning to crack, and the lightning usually sent by Zeus merged with Typhon's fury, creating an apocalyptic spectacle on the horizon. The sight of Typhon approaching, with his gargantuan silhouette and wings of destruction, made even the bravest gods hesitate. For some, fear was evident in their eyes, but no one dared turn their backs. Even Zeus, who had reigned sovereign for so many years, felt the weight of a fear he had never experienced, a fear that did not come from his mortal enemies, but from a force of nature as primal and uncontrollable as chaos itself. Amid the terror, one thought dominated everyone's mind: the war was about to begin, and the consequences would be catastrophic. Meanwhile, Gaia, with a satisfied smile, watched from her hiding place. She felt that she had finally done what seemed impossible: challenge the gods of Olympus. With Typhon leading the charge, and with the help of his monstrous children created by Echidna, she was ready to destroy the world's order and usher in a new era of chaos and vengeance. As Typhon approached, the peace of Olympus was forever torn apart, and a new era of darkness and destruction began. The battle that would follow would be the greatest the Olympian pantheon had ever witnessed. The sound of Typhon's roar reverberated. Through the hills and mountains, a battle cry that froze even the bravest hearts in Olympus. Destruction was closing in, and Mount Olympus, once considered untouchable, now trembled under the weight of the immense shadow extending over it. The gods, who had reigned with such power and confidence, were paralyzed by panic. No one expected such a terrifying threat to arise from the depths of the underworld. Even the oldest gods, like Poseidon and Hera, felt fear creep in, a primal terror that made them question whether they could truly face this destructive force. The sight of Typhon, with his dozens of dragon heads and flaming eyes, was indescribably terrifying. He seemed not to be a divine creature, but something beyond, something that even the gods themselves could not comprehend or control. Every step he took made the earth tremble, and the sky grew darker as he advanced. Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war, was one of the first to try and maintain her composure. She knew that to face such an immense enemy, a strategy was required. However, even the sharpest mind seemed powerless against Typhon's fury. She gathered with the other gods, trying to organize a defense, but doubt had already spread like a virus among them. "Can we do this?" she asked herself, though she dared not speak it aloud. Ares, the god of war, with his impetuous spirit, was ready to fight, but even he hesitated before the monstrosity approaching. "How do we face a being that destroys everything in its path?" he asked, his gaze full of uncertainty. Zeus, the leader of the gods, stared at Typhon with a grim expression. The first time he felt the weight of fear was in that moment, but he couldn't show weakness. He was Zeus, the lord of the sky, and it was his responsibility to protect Olympus and maintain order. But Typhon's power was something he had never anticipated. Even with his thunderbolt in hand, he couldn't prevent the anxiety from creeping in. How could he, the king of the gods, defeat such a destructive force? However, it was Athena who tried to take the lead, using her reason to calm the others. "The battle is not lost yet," she said, her voice firm, but a slight concern reflected in her eyes. "We need time to organize our forces and find a way to weaken Typhon. We can't just give in to fear." Hermes, the messenger of the gods, was restless, running back and forth, trying to find a way to communicate with the other gods and alert them to the urgency of the situation. He knew that any failure in planning would mean the end of Olympus. Yet panic was spreading quickly, and many were beginning to doubt victory. Hera, the goddess of marriage, was paralyzed, not just by fear, but by a sense of helplessness. She, who had always been a defender of power and authority in Olympus, couldn't understand how this was happening. What had they done to deserve such a devastating vengeance? And as the gods debated in panic, Typhon's arrival was imminent. The monster was only a few steps from Mount Olympus, and his massive wings beat with a sound that resembled the crash of thunder. With each beat, Olympus trembled more, and destruction seemed inevitable. Zeus, gazing at the horizon and feeling the weight of being the leader, finally spoke with the grave voice of someone who had knowledge, but also an unease only a leader in times of crisis could understand. "Olympus has always symbolized order, but it will not be through strength alone that we prevail. We need to fight with everything we have, not just for our survival, but for everything that Olympus represents." It was too late to hide. The gates of Olympus were open to an enemy who showed no mercy, and the sense of helplessness spread like poison through the veins of the gods. They were ready to fight, but no one knew what the cost of the approaching battle would be. The true nature of the war revealed itself not just as a battle of forces, but as a struggle for the fate of all the beings who inhabited Mount Olympus and the gods themselves. Typhon's arrival was not just the beginning of a physical battle. It was the start of a test of endurance, courage, and loyalty. And with each passing second, panic continued to spread among the gods. As Typhon, with his destructive presence, came closer and closer, Olympus would never be the same again. The panic that was consuming Olympus began to corrode the gods' confidence. Typhon's presence, monstrous and unbeatable, threatened the very balance of the divine world. As the other gods discussed frantically what to do, one figure stood out among them, firm as a rock amidst the storm. Athena, the goddess of wisdom and strategy, was not given to fear. She understood the magnitude of the threat, but she also knew that the only chance for Olympus to resist was the unity of the forces. However, there was a concern that tormented her. It wasn't just Typhon's size, but the speed with which he was destroying every attempt at resistance. Even for her, a sharp mind and a resolute heart, there was something impossible to ignore. This was not an enemy that could be defeated with cunning and strength alone, but that didn't stop her from trying. With determination in her eyes, Athena looked at Zeus, her father. He was there, standing with a grim expression, but the weight of the world on his shoulders. She knew he didn't want to show weakness, but his gaze spoke more than words could say. He was exhausted, not just physically, but emotionally. As a leader, he carried the burden of every decision, and Typhon was the threat he hadn't foreseen. "Athena," said Zeus, his voice low, filled with a weariness she had never seen before. "There is no more time. Olympus is doomed, and I can't—" But Athena didn't let him finish. With a firm step, she approached her father and placed her hand on his shoulder, interrupting his words. "We can't give up, father. Not yet. If we let fear take us, Olympus will fall. I'll delay him. Give us time." Zeus looked at her, a mix of respect and concern in his gaze. "Athena, Typhon is not an ordinary threat. He will destroy us." But Athena already knew what she had to do. It wasn't the first time she had faced a force almost impossible to defeat, and although her mind was full of strategies and tactics, she knew she would need more than just her intelligence to survive. She would have to sacrifice something, perhaps even her own life, to ensure her brothers and sisters had time to escape. Without another word, Athena turned and went toward the front line, where the first signs of destruction were already beginning to spread. Typhon was getting closer, his dragon head spitting fire that consumed everything around him. The goddess of wisdom, in her shining armor and with her sharp spear, did not hesitate. She approached the edge of Olympus and raised her spear to the sky. "For the honor of Olympus, I will delay the monster. But I need everyone to prepare for battle. If we must fall, let us fall fighting." With a roar, Typhon rose in all his magnitude, seeing Athena before him. His laughter echoed through Olympus, a laugh full of contempt and destruction. But Athena did not move. She knew she couldn't defeat him alone, but she could buy time, perhaps even weaken him with what she knew he feared: her own intelligence. She faced Typhon with unwavering courage, dodging flames and attacks with impressive agility. With every move, she dodged, struck, and retreated, but always keeping a clear strategy in mind: delay him as much as possible so the gods could escape and organize. Every strike she made was not to win, but to weaken Typhon's confidence, making him more reckless, more uncontrollable. But the battle didn't last long. Typhon, with all his strength and rage, began to react with growing fury. One of his most powerful attacks was a stream of poisonous fire that hit the goddess, causing her to fall to her knees. The heat was unbearable, and the poison coursing through her veins clouded her mind. Despite the pain, Athena rose again, her expression one of even stronger determination. She knew the battle would not be won by her, but her mission was clear. By time for Olympus, even if it cost her life. She glanced at Zeus one last time, her eyes filled with silent sadness. Her resistance was starting to weaken, but not before Typhon hesitated for the first time. With a fierce roar, Typhon lunged to deliver the final blow, but before he could reach Athena, something changed. For a moment, something within him wavered. The monster, so wild and uncontrollable, was slowed by Athena's intelligence, by the way she challenged his brute force with her cunning. But not for long. Before she could react, a final blow struck her with brutal force, knocking her to the ground and leaving her unconscious. Typhon, now enraged, rose to continue his march toward the heart of Olympus, while the gods, in shock, realized the battle was far from over. Athena's courage was undeniable. She had given everything to delay the catastrophe, but Olympus now faced terror closer than ever before. Olympus was on the brink of collapse. Athena's last attempt had been heroic, but in vain. Typhon, merciless and unbeatable, moved forward without stopping, leaving a trail of destruction behind him. The bravery of the goddess of wisdom had given the other gods time to organize, but now the time for the final decision had arrived. They could no longer face the monster. The fight no longer made sense. The tension on Olympus was palpable, and the fear, something the gods had never experienced so intensely, paralyzed them. It was a strange feeling, as if the very divine pantheon was on the verge of being wiped from existence. Zeus, who had always commanded with absolute authority, was now faced with a reality that challenged him in a way he didn't know how to. "Control! Run!" Zeus ordered, his voice echoing across the mountain but lacking the same confidence as before. "This is not our fight. Olympus cannot be destroyed by a creature like him." But it wasn't just words of courage coming from the king of the gods. Fear was present as well. Even with his powers, he knew Typhon was a force beyond his comprehension. Each roar of the monster made the heavens themselves tremble. Hermes, who had always been the quick and clever messenger, was visibly shaken. His agility, which had saved him from countless dangerous situations, couldn't help this time. He knew panic was spreading across the mountain, and if the gods didn't retreat immediately, they would all be consumed by Typhon's fury. "Zeus, we need to leave now!" Hermes exclaimed, looking at Athena, who was still recovering from the brutal battle. "She did everything she could. Now it's our turn to run, or we'll be destroyed too." The other gods were in complete panic. Some crouched down, desperate, while others ran in all directions. There was no longer any place to face the battle on equal terms. Fear spread like fire in a dry field. I'm going to Egypt," said Aphrodite, her eyes filled with terror. "There, humans don't know who we are. If we have to survive, it will be there." Hermes looked at her, then at the other gods. He knew they needed to act quickly, or they would all be caught. Without hesitation, he picked up Athena in his arms, preparing to flee. The goddess was still unconscious, but her expression showed the deep pain she had endured. Zeus, for his part, looked around. His brothers and sisters were in panic, unsure of what to do. Mount Olympus was about to be invaded, and the possibility of losing everything they had built for millennia was a real threat. He, the great king of the gods, had never imagined he would have to flee from an enemy. "Run to wherever you can," shouted Zeus. "Take any form, any face, any body that will help you hide. Olympus is no longer ours." And with that, an unexpected turn of events occurred. What was once the heart of divine power, the center of the gods' realm, had now become a field of flight. The majesty of Olympus was destroyed not by epic battles, but by the simple reality that even the gods were not safe. Most of the gods transformed into animals, assuming forms that humans couldn't recognize. Zeus, the feared ruler, transformed into a mighty eagle, his wings beating forcefully toward the distant Egypt, where he hoped to hide until the threat was neutralized. Athena, in his arms, was being carried by Hermes, who had also taken the form of an eagle, hoping that the speed of their flight would be enough to escape the monster. Aphrodite, in turn, transformed into a dove, a symbol of peace, but also of desperate flight. Apollo took the form of a lynx, his eyes radiant and swift, and Artemis, his sister, became a doe, light and silent as the breeze. The other gods scattered, disappearing into the vast landscapes of the mortal world, trying to keep their essence hidden from Typhon's eyes. And so, in a moment of panic and flight, what had once been a powerful pantheon was now reduced to shadows and disguises, unable to fight against what had emerged from the underworld. Mount Olympus, which had once been the home of immortality and glory, was now empty, as if the very divine essence had been ripped from it. But one thing was certain: Typhon had changed the course of the gods' history. Olympus was no longer a safe place. The flight was over, But the fear that dominated Zeus did not dissipate. He flew alone, moving away from the known lands, his soul filled with confusion. With each powerful beat of his wings, he reflected on the events. His children, the other gods, were now scattered across the world, fleeing from Typhon like mere mortals. He, the king of Olympus, the god of thunder and the sky, had been forced to abandon his home, but there was something inside him, a flame that refused to go out. Zeus felt that he could not live with the shame of abandoning Olympus forever. A growing anger burned within him, a desire to reclaim what was his, and most importantly, avenge the humiliation that he and the other gods had suffered. As he crossed the vast Egyptian desert, the wind cutting through his face, Zeus had a revelation. He knew he couldn't keep running, that the fight had to be fought at some point, no matter the cost. For his honor, for the honor of Olympus, and for all those who had believed in him. It would not be Typhon, or any creature from the underworld, that would force him to hide forever. It was clear he had to face the monster, but he couldn't do it alone. Zeus made a decision, even knowing the risks. With a quick gesture, he summoned Hermes, the clever messenger, the only one who hadn't strayed. "Hermes," he said with renewed firmness, "we cannot let panic take over everyone. Olympus was forged with the strength of the gods, and it will not be destroyed by a creature of the underworld. I will face Typhon again, and this time I won't fail." Hermes, who was reluctant to return to the battlefield, looked at Zeus with a mix of concern and reverence. He knew the king of the gods was determined, but he also knew the situation was desperate. "Zeus, you've already been defeated once," he said hesitantly. "The monster is stronger than any of us imagined. Even with your lightning, he resisted. Do you really think you can beat him now?" Zeus looked at the distant horizon, where storms were beginning to form again, and lightning cut through the sky with force, as if reflecting his own inner fury. "I have no choice, Hermes. Olympus cannot fall. I need to rebuild what was destroyed. You don't have to fight, but you'll help me get back there, not for me, but for all those who depend on us." Hermes remained silent for a moment, contemplating Zeus's words. He knew that the leader of the gods was beyond reason at that moment, but the loyalty he felt for him made him decide. "I'll help you, Zeus, but that doesn't mean it will be easy. Typhon is different, stronger than any enemy we've ever faced. Even for you." Zeus approached Hermes and with a resolute look said, "I know, but the true strength of a god is not only in what he can destroy, but in what he is capable of rebuilding. I will reverse this destruction and bring back the light of Olympus." The decision was made. Hermes prepared to guide Zeus back to Mount Olympus, and as he did, he felt a new energy emerging in his master. Something had changed in him since the defeat, and now he was more determined than ever to prove that Olympus would not be defeated. The two set off, with Hermes leading them through the desert, to the point from where they could travel again to the skies. Zeus knew he would face an even tougher battle, but his spirit was renewed. He felt that if he could reclaim what he had lost, not only Olympus but the very balance of the worlds would be restored. And with that, Zeus's journey to redeem his honor and challenge Typhon's wrath once again was about to begin. Zeus and Hermes arrived at Mount Olympus, now in ruins, the place where once the power of the gods resonated with an unmatched force, now lay silent and desolate, nature reclaiming the grandeur that had once been. The heavy black clouds, brought by the approaching storm, seemed to reflect the gravity of the situation. Olympus was vulnerable, and Typhon, with his dragon heads and fiery eyes, continued to lurk in the depths, awaiting the moment of his final victory. Zeus felt a growing heat in his hands. The electricity in the air seemed to mirror his state of mind, agitated, furious, and ready for battle. "Now," he said to Hermes, his voice strong but deep, "it's time to finally end this." Hermes nodded with a tense smile, knowing the moment of truth had finally arrived. With a fierce shout, Zeus raised his arm and threw a bolt of lightning with the intensity of 1,000 storms. The energy coursed through his body as if it were part of his very essence. The lightning cut through the sky, lighting up the horizon as it headed directly for the monstrous figure of Typhon. But the monster didn't flinch. With incomprehensible strength, he raised one of his arms and with a terrifying roar, deflected the lightning with a casual gesture, as if the power of the gods meant nothing in the face of his strength. Typhon immediately counterattacked. With a swift movement, he threw fireballs and poison, which spread across the battlefield, creating a toxic cloud that forced Zeus and Hermes to retreat to avoid the explosion. "He's much stronger than before," shouted Hermes, his voice filled with concern. Zeus, though wounded by the force of the counterattack, kept his focus. The ground was on fire, and the sky seemed at war with the earth. But he couldn't stop. The fight had only just begun. The king of the gods knew that his lightning alone wouldn't win. He would need a more refined strategy, something that took advantage of the terrain and his connection to the skies. "Hermes, get ready," Zeus said with determination. "This fight won't be won on the ground. We'll take Typhon to the skies." He launched himself upward, dragging a fierce storm in his wake. Hermes followed closely behind, knowing that despite the difficulties, they needed every advantage possible to stop the monster that challenged the very foundations of Olympus. The first clash, however, was far from over. The greatest of all enemies was only beginning to show his full strength. The sky trembled with the fury of the forces colliding. Zeus and Typhon danced in the air, exchanging attacks and defenses, the battle intensifying with every second. Zeus's lightning illuminated the horizon, while Typhon, with his immense and monstrous form, delivered devastating blows with his many dragon heads and razor-sharp claws. Each movement of the monster seemed to tear apart the very reality around them, and the earth trembled beneath their feet. Zeus, despite his enormous strength, was beginning to feel the weight of the battle. Every lightning bolt he threw seemed to be absorbed by the vast energy emanating from Typhon, and his fire and poison attacks continued to strike him with frightening accuracy. The king of the gods was already wounded, his strength waning, and for the first time since he had taken command of Olympus, he felt that defeat might be imminent. When Typhon realized that Zeus was weakening, he decided to deliver the final blow. With a roar that echoed to the ends of the world, he lunged at Zeus with unexpected speed. Before the thunder god could react, Typhon grabbed him in his claws, crushing him with colossal force. Zeus's lightning fell to the ground, extinguishing, like a flame snuffed out by the vastness of darkness. With a brutal movement, Typhon tore Zeus's limbs off, making him scream in pain. Every part of the god's body was ripped away with a cruelty that could never have been imagined. The earth around the battlefield split, and Typhon's forces were able to subdue even Zeus's lightning. The monster laughed, a sound that resonated like distant thunder as he held the pieces of Zeus's body in his claws, hiding them in a cave deep in the depths, guarded by Echidna, his monstrous companion. Zeus, immobilized and mutilated, knew that his fight had ended for the moment. His vision was blurry, his body exhausted, and the weight of defeat consumed him. But in the distance, a spark of hope still remained. Hermes, watching from afar, knew that the only chance for Zeus to return would be through his actions. Even without strength, Hermes could not allow his master to perish there. He stealthily approached, doing his best not to be seen by Typhon, and began to devise a plan to rescue the king of the gods from his brutal prison. The battle was far from over, but Zeus's suffering had marked the beginning of a new phase in the fight for Olympus's survival. Hermes was in a desperate situation. The defeat of Zeus was a sight he had never imagined witnessing. His lord, the king of the gods, was captured, mutilated, and buried in the depths, guarded by Echidna and with Typhon watching the area. But there was something in Hermes, something he could not ignore: the guilt. He had not stayed by Zeus's side during the final battle, and now it was his responsibility to correct that mistake. The messenger of the gods knew that to free Zeus, he would need to act with precision. He used all his cunning and speed, invisible to Typhon's eyes, slipping through the shadows, his legs as quick as the wind. He approached the cave where Zeus was being kept, and as he got close, he felt a chill. Echidna, the creature who had been tasked with guarding the pieces of Zeus, was lying in front of the entrance, her dark eyes fixed on the darkness. Hermes didn't know how to face her directly. The creature was dangerous and unpredictable. Hermes's mind began to work quickly. He knew he couldn't defeat her physically, but there was something else he could use: words. If he could distract Echidna, perhaps he could reach the pieces of Zeus and leave unnoticed. With a mischievous smile, Hermes approached the creature, moving slowly so as not to make a sound. "Echidna, great mother of monsters, did you know you could use a helping hand?" he said, his voice soft as the wind. Echidna raised her head, her eyes shining with curiosity. She looked at him with distrust, but also with a hint of interest. "Why do you bother me, messenger of the gods? I was waiting for someone to dare approach." Hermes, with his skill at manipulating words and ideas, didn't waste any time. He spoke of Typhon's fears, his insecurity about his rise to power, and suggested that he was more concerned with his victory than with guarding Zeus. He wove a story of ambition and mistrust, and as he hoped, Echidna, who had always held a safe place in the shadows, began to become restless. She was tired of serving Typhon, tired of being the guardian of his dark empire. As Echidna began to reflect, Hermes seized the opportunity. With a quick and silent movement, he approached the cave where the pieces of Zeus were kept. He didn't have time to hesitate. With a light touch, he gathered the scattered limbs of the king of the gods, and using his golden wings, flew out of the cave. Time was against him, and he needed to act fast. Meanwhile, Echidna, lost in her thoughts, didn't notice that the messenger had completed his mission and vanished into the darkness. Hermes flew high, faster than the wind, with Zeus's remains in his arms. The mission was far from over, but a glimmer of hope ignited. Now the rescue was complete, but the greatest challenge was yet to come. Hermes knew he would have to do more than just piece the body together. He would need to restore Zeus's strength for a new confrontation, and for that, he needed to act quickly. The fate of Mount Olympus was in his hands. Hermes flew toward Mount Olympus, his mind swirling with the weight of the mission. The sky was overcast, and the stars seemed distant, as if the universe itself was in tune with the chaos unfolding. He knew he couldn't waste any time. Zeus, though immensely powerful, was gravely wounded, and Typhon's victory had not only been a physical blow, but a threat to the very order of the world. If Zeus couldn't recover quickly, the destruction of Olympus would be inevitable. Arriving at Olympus, Hermes headed to the temple of Asclepius, the god of healing, who stood out as the master of divine medical arts. Hermes' hope rested on Asclepius' power, as he knew the god of healing could restore Zeus. However, the path ahead wouldn't be easy, for Asclepius, though kind, knew that healing a being as powerful as Zeus would require sacrifices. It was a magic that demanded strength and balance, something even the gods were unaccustomed to facing. Upon finding Asclepius, Hermes quickly explained the situation, his eyes filled with anxiety and determination. "We need your help, Asclepius. Zeus is on the brink of death, and our only chance is to restore his limbs. The fate of Olympus is in your hands." Asclepius, with a serious and serene look, accepted the request but warned, "The cure will not be easy. Restoring such a powerful god requires more than magic. He will need time, and you will need to be patient." As Asclepius prepared the spell to reunite Zeus' limbs, Hermes couldn't help but feel a tightness in his chest. He knew time was against them. Typhon was still at large, and the chaos he had caused in the underworld could affect the skies at any moment. What else could the gods do if Zeus failed? The pressure was almost unbearable. With Asclepius's words echoing in his mind, Hermes helped gather the energies needed for the spell. The room where they stood lit up with a golden glow, and Zeus's limbs began to shine. Slowly, the parts of the god started to come together again, but the recovery wasn't instant. Asclepius worked with care, channeling his magic skillfully, while Hermes, standing by, held his breath, waiting for the miracle. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Zeus began to breathe again. His body, now whole, was bathed in a radiant light, his strength gradually returning, but there was still a battle to be fought. Although Zeus was now healed, he knew that the confrontation with Typhon had not been resolved. The forces of darkness continued to gather, and he needed to be ready to face them again, stronger than ever. The king of the gods looked at Hermes with gratitude, his eyes now more alive, more powerful. "You did the impossible, Hermes. Now we have a chance to defeat Typhon and save Olympus." The hope that had seemed to fade for a moment now renewed with Zeus' recovery. The final battle was approaching, and a new determination arose in the forces of Olympus. The true test of strength was about to begin, and no one could deny that the war for control of the world was far from over. With Zeus now restored and stronger than ever, Hermes knew the final battle against Typhon would not be easy. The monster was still at large, and the winds of destruction continued to blow across the land. But there was one last hope, a strategy that could turn the tide in favor of the gods: the deception of the Fates. The Fates, the three sisters who wove destiny, were powerful and unpredictable beings. They held control over the thread of life of all beings, both mortal and divine. Zeus, with the wisdom he had gained over the years, knew they could be the key to weakening Typhon. However, it wouldn't be an easy task. The Fates were cunning and, despite their power, were relentless when challenged. The only way to approach them would be through a subtle deception, something Hermes, with his craftiness and skill, knew how to do better than any other god. Together with Zeus, Hermes set out for Mount Nysa, home of the Fates, where the sisters awaited their meeting. The surroundings were heavy with tension, as if the mountains themselves felt the weight of what was to come. Upon arrival, they were greeted by Clotho, the spinner of fate, who, with a penetrating look, already knew the intentions of the gods. She smiled faintly, aware that manipulating Typhon's destiny would require more than mere words. Hermes, ever quick and sharp, began the conversation with the Fates, speaking of the greatness of the world, the balance they maintained, and how Typhon's nature threatened to destabilize the entire universal order. "He is no longer just a threat. He is an abomination," said Hermes with his sharp tongue. "Not only does he disrespect the gods, but he defies fate itself. The chaos he represents could destroy everything you, the Fates, have worked so hard to protect." Hermes' words began to strike a chord with the Fates. They, though confident in their ability to control destinies, were deeply connected to the balance of the universe and could not allow any being, even a monster as powerful as Typhon, to disrupt that balance. But the Fates were cautious and demanded something in return. They wanted to ensure that by helping the gods, the outcome would benefit the cosmos without bringing unforeseen consequences. Zeus, with his authority, intervened and promised that, after their victory over Typhon, the order of the world would be restored. with the gods once again establishing a just and balanced reign. That was enough to convince the fates to collaborate. They agreed, but not without first weaving a poisoned spell. A spell that would make Typhon believe he was invincible, that he was about to conquer everything, while in reality he was slowly being weakened. They would make him think the victory was his, until it was too late. The fates handed Hermes a basket of magical fruits with a golden liquid that shone like the sun. "Give this to Typhon," ordered Clotho, her voice unwavering. "He will believe. He is receiving the greatest of powers, but in reality, it will be his poison. He will lose his strength, his energy, and when that happens, you will have your chance." With the plan set, Hermes returned to Olympus, knowing that the next stage of the battle would be decisive. The monster was about to be deceived, and the forces of Olympus, now with the help of the fates, were more prepared than ever. The tension was in the air, and everyone knew that soon the final confrontation between Zeus and Typhon would reach its dramatic climax. But until then, the fates had woven a new destiny, and the war was about to turn in their favor. Zeus, now strengthened by the help of the fates, felt that the time to end this war was near. He knew the last piece of the puzzle was about to fall into place, but he also knew the monster was more dangerous than ever. Typhon had been poisoned by the magical fruits, but the fury of his nature and the size of his rage were not easy to control. The trap Zeus had planned needed to be precise, flawless, otherwise the outcome could be disastrous. With the help of Hermes and the fates, Zeus devised a bold plan. The idea was to lure Typhon to a place where his strength would be nullified, where the monster would feel the terrain was in his favor until it was too late for him to escape. Mount Nysa, where the fates had cast their spell, was the initial meeting point. From there, Zeus decided to lead Typhon to a cliff, a mountain with enormous cliffs, where Typhon's power would be diluted by the terrain's conditions. As always, Hermes would be the messenger, bringing Typhon to the location. He knew that, although the monster was incredibly strong, his arrogance could be his greatest weakness. Typhon believed his victory was certain, that no god could stop him, and that was exactly what Zeus counted on to take full advantage. He knew that when the monster entered the chosen spot, he would have a false sense of invulnerability. Upon reaching the cliff, Zeus began his part of the plan. He started summoning lightning from the sky with such intensity that the earth trembled. Black clouds began to form as he prepared the fiercest storm he had ever unleashed on any enemy. Typhon, who thought he was winning, didn't realize the real battle was about to begin. He laughed, believing the lightning was just a distraction. But when Zeus split the sky open with an explosion of energy, Typhon was struck by a bolt, so powerful that the ground beneath him shook. However, the monster didn't fall. He raised his hundreds of heads, spewing fire and poison, furious with what seemed like a mere provocation. Typhon charged at Zeus with all his might, but the treacherous terrain and the storm didn't favor his attacks. With every step he took, the ground cracked and his strength seemed to drain away. The trap was working. Zeus, with the lightning under his control, had initiated the attack with a clear purpose: to weaken Typhon and force him deeper into a cliff where he would be cornered. With each lightning strike, Typhon retreated further until finally the monster reached the point of no return. The sky opened once again, and Zeus concentrated all his energy into a colossal bolt. He struck with deadly precision, hitting Typhon directly in the heart. The energy emanating from the attack was so intense that Typhon screamed, but the sound of his fury was drowned out by the explosion of lightning. The monster, weakened, staggered back, but the ground was already starting to give way. Typhon lost his balance and fell, trying to cling to the rocks as the earth collapsed beneath his weight. Seeing his chance, Zeus launched one final attack, and the entire mountain began to crumble. The cliff gave way completely, and Typhon was swallowed by the earth. The battle was won. But even so, panic didn't vanish immediately. Zeus knew that the monster wouldn't be easily defeated, and that his temporary capture didn't mean permanent peace. He would need to ensure that once imprisoned, Typhon wouldn't have the strength to rise again. With the monster finally trapped under tons of rock, Zeus, Hermes, and the Fates breathed a sigh of relief. But the war was not over. The end of Typhon's battle might have been reached, but the impact of his rise and the memory of the destruction he caused would echo forever. Olympus had won for now, but the future, with its own threats, was already taking shape. With Typhon's roar silenced by the immense force of Zeus's attack, Olympus finally began to breathe easy. However, the victory didn't feel complete, as the monster had only been imprisoned, and his power couldn't be underestimated. The earth, now closing in on him, was saturated with Typhon's fury, and a sense of unease still lingered over the mountain. The monster had fallen, but not without leaving a profound impression. Zeus, watching the spot where Typhon had been swallowed by the rocks, knew the fight was still not fully resolved. He looked at the mountain with a determined gaze, preparing to seal the monster's fate once and for all. "Let this mountain be the eternal tomb of Typhon," he said in a deep voice, his presence radiating authority. The king of the gods didn't want any trace of the monster to ever rise again. He would not allow Typhon to resurface from the depths. For that to happen, the monster needed to be buried under a mountain so massive that escape would be impossible. With a powerful gesture, Zeus made the ground tremble once more, and the mountain that had seemed stable now began to crumble even further. Rocks fell on the monster's body, trapping him in the depths of a vast cavern. The tremor seemed to swallow everything, as if Olympus itself was trying to hide the mistake of creating such a terrible creature. Every piece of earth that fell seemed to cut off any possibility of resurrection. Typhon was now buried, completely immobilized. The earth, as if to ensure that evil would never return, covered him relentlessly. Hermes, always by Zeus's side, watched closely. He knew this was the end of Typhon's threat, but the sight of the monster being imprisoned so brutally still unsettled him. It was hard to believe that at one point, that gigantic being, which caused so much chaos and destruction, was now completely crushed under the earth. Olympus was safe, but Typhon's story, his origin, and his rise would still leave scars in the gods' memories. Typhon, the terror that caused so much suffering, had finally been buried, but the mountain covering his body, the place where he would rest forever, would become a place of legend and fear. Zeus knew that the monster wouldn't die like mortals, but would remain imprisoned forever as a grim reminder of his origin and his power. And as much as the victory was celebrated on Olympus, the memories of the battle and Typhon's threat would not be easily erased. Silence took over Olympus. The war, which seemed endless, had now reached a moment of pause. Zeus, now victorious, looked at his fellow deities, and the tension that had once filled the air began to dissipate. They had overcome the chaos, but they knew peace could be temporary. The world of gods, monsters, and humans was always on the brink of a new catastrophe. However, at that moment, the victory was theirs, and the destruction of Typhon was a step toward restoring the order that had been deeply threatened. But above all, it was clear that Zeus's power and determination were unshakable. Still, a doubt hung in the air. Although Typhon was buried under the mountain, what else might the underworld hide? What else was ready to challenge Olympus? The reign of the gods was secure, but the balance between chaos and order would never be guaranteed, and Typhon's story would serve as a reminder that danger could resurface from anywhere at any time. Though the victory over Typhon was a great achievement for Zeus and the gods of Olympus, the impact of his defeat reverberated in unforeseen ways. The earth, still marked by the titanic battle, began to transform. The spot where Typhon had been buried, now covered by rocks and darkness, became an epicenter of activity. The pressure on the imprisoned monster, along with the cosmic forces surrounding his chaotic nature, caused an unexpected change: the emergence of a new mountain. In the heart of the Sicily region, the ground began to tremble again. These were not tremors from a battle, but a manifestation of primordial power. The earth cracked, rocks rose, and a massive crater opened, from which a column of smoke and lava began to rise, lighting the night sky with a red, threatening glow. The mountain was being born. Slowly, but with a grand rumble, Mount Etna was emerging, as if the earth itself was trying to rid itself of the violence that had been deposited there. The inhabitants of the region, witnessing the rise of the volcano, began to tell stories. To them, the mountain was not just a geological accident. It was a symbol of Typhon's power, a creature who, even though buried under the rocks, was still present. The eruption of Etna became a living legend, a manifestation of the chaos he represented. The fire rising from its peak was not just lava, but the essence of the monster himself. It was believed that, whenever the volcano erupted, Typhon was attempting to escape, battling against the earth's chains that held him captive. The gods of Olympus, knowing that the threat of Typhon had been contained, grew concerned. The eruption of Mount Etna was not just a natural event, it was a reminder of the monster's power, proof that his fury had not been completely neutralized. Zeus, now more cautious, understood that Mount Etna was not just an ordinary mountain. It was a pressure point, a release valve where Typhon's power still echoed. He watched the volcano from afar, aware that the piece might be more fragile than he had imagined. And so, while the gods returned to their routine as the powerful rulers of Olympus, the constant eruption of Etna reminded them that the battle against chaos would never be completely won. Typhon, though buried, continued to influence the world through the fire and destruction that rose from his tomb. Mortals who saw the volcano erupt feared that the creature, with its immortal rage, was about to awaken. They feared that one day, Typhon would find a way to break the chains of the earth and return to the surface. Meanwhile, Mount Etna became not just a symbol of destruction, but also a reminder of the eternal struggle between the gods' power and the chaotic forces that could never be fully subdued. Somewhere, deep in the earth where the monster was buried, the sound of lava rising through the crater seemed to resonate like a distant echo of Typhon's roar, reminding everyone that even the greatest triumphs over chaos are only temporary. As Olympus tried to restore balance and Zeus's forces established an apparent peace, the underworld was on the brink of collapse. Typhon, in his immense fury and power, had not only caused destruction in the upper world, but had also left his mark in the very heart of the earth. The battle against the monster had deep reverberations that reached the lower realms, where Hades ruled with a firm hand, maintaining the balance between the dead and the living. With Typhon's final moments approaching, something was broken in. The underworld, the seal that kept the most dangerous demons, monsters, and spirits under control, was weakened by the pressure from the battles between Zeus and the monster. Typhon's terror and revolt seemed to have awakened a primordial force. At the very heart of the underworld itself, the chains that bound the wildest creatures began to break. In the darkest corners, monsters and lost souls rose, sensing that the battle above had opened a breach for their escape. The chaos that spread through the underworld was unprecedented. Doors that had been firmly closed for ages were now open. Vengeful spirits and ancient creatures who'd been waiting for millennia now saw a chance to escape their captivity. Legend said that even the souls of the Titans imprisoned in the depths were stirring, feeling the revolution of chaos. Even Cerberus, The massive three-headed dog guarding the gates of the underworld was restless, reacting to the growing tension. In his home, Hades, the lord of the underworld, was the first to realize how grave the situation had become. The throne he sat upon seemed to tremble under his weight. He knew the world of the dead was on the verge of a new cycle of destruction, something he had never witnessed in all his existence. He rushed to seal the breaches in the underworld, using all the power of his realm to contain the force trying to break free. However, Typhon's forces were powerful, and Hades had to battle against his own creation, trying to maintain order in a place where chaos had already begun to leak through the edges. In the following days, monsters that had been chained for millennia began to move again, breaking the chains that held them. Hades had to mobilize his forces to prevent the underworld from descending into complete despair. Beings like the Minotaur, the Sphinx, and even the Furies were on the move again, their eyes burning with fury. The wandering souls stirred in their prisons, eager to leave their torment and spread terror across all corners. The balance, which had once seemed well maintained under Hades' rule, was now at risk. Panic in the depths grew, and even the darkest shadows of the underworld began to stir. Hades' reign was being threatened by the same force that had been defeated at Mount Etna. And while Zeus watched over the skies, the lord of the underworld was caught in an endless battle to prevent Typhon's chaos from destroying the very fabric of death and damnation. Meanwhile, the legends of the underworld began to grow among mortals. Many began to hear rumors that Hades himself was at war against an invasion from the depths, an invasion that involved not only monsters, but the very lost souls and titans who longed for revenge against the gods of Olympus. Humanity was aware that the line between the living and the dead was thinner than ever, and the underworld, once a place of silence, now echoed with the cries of an eternal revolution. At the epicenter of the revolution within the underworld, a new figure emerged. From the shadows, Cerberus, the faithful three-headed dog, had always been the guardian of the gates to the realm of the dead, relentless and shrewd, keeping wandering spirits and dangerous creatures away from the living. But with the rise in chaos, Cerberus' role became more crucial. Sensing the agitation in every corner of his home, he was forced to become more than just a simple guardian. He would need to become a symbol of resistance, the only real barrier between the underworld and the freedom of the creatures that lived there. Hades, aware that his strength was already being diluted by the threats arising throughout the realm of the dead, needed to ensure that at least the gates of the underworld remained closed. It was then that, in a desperate gesture, he called upon Cerberus for a role grander than the one he had always played. Not only would the dog guard the gates, but he would become the new protector of the very balance of the underworld, confronting the horrors, attempting to escape and restoring the order that was collapsing. Hades knew that with Cerberus' power and the ancient strength he possessed, the underworld could be saved. However, the bond between Cerberus and Hades, which had always been one of obedience and respect, began to deepen in unexpected ways. Cerberus, with his three heads, each with a unique personality, began to question his loyalty and the purpose of his existence. As chaos increased, he felt a greater calling, a need to act not just as a simple dog, but as a being with his own destiny. Hades, no matter how much he tried to maintain control, realized that there was something more in Cerberus. The dog was no longer just a guardian, but now a leader within the underworld, with the strength and instinct needed to face the horrors being set free. Cerberus, as he became more than just a monstrous creature, began to feed off the rising chaos, finding power in the chains breaking, in the violence of the lost souls trying to escape. He felt transformed. Each of his three faces reflected a facet of the underworld. The first, of rage and strength, represented the justice imposed by Hades. The second, calmer and more thoughtful, reflected the eternal dilemma of maintaining balance, even when everything seemed to be falling apart. And the third, darker and more treacherous, represented inner chaos, the primal instinct that wanted to see the underworld collapse, a reflection of what Typhon's forces had awakened within all of them. Meanwhile, the other beings trapped in the depths began to notice the change in Cerberus. They who had always seen him as a mere beast began to view him as a new leader, someone who could command them in a rebellion against Hades and even against Zeus. But Cerberus, now wiser and more shrewd, knew that the real threat was not just the creatures escaping, but the very balance of the underworld. He realized that if he gave in to the temptation of chaos, what would remain would be a land without laws, without control. Instead of becoming a leader for the rebels, Cerberus chose to follow Hades's path, attempting, in his own way, to restore balance and prevent the underworld from being destroyed by forces beyond anyone's control. As time went on, the figure of Cerberus became a living legend in the underworld. No longer just a dog, but a guardian, a symbol of the constant struggle between chaos and order. Cerberus's presence at the gates of the underworld, standing before all who tried to escape, became a warning. Chaos, though a tempting force, would never be free. He, the new guardian, would keep the gates closed, no matter the cost, until the last spark of order was restored and the underworld could finally find peace again. The underworld was in ruins, and Hades knew that the only way to save his realm was to restore the order that had been broken. The monsters, prisoners, and even the souls of the dead were out of control, spreading through the shadows and threatening to escape into the world of the living. Chaos, fueled by Typhon's power and the revolt of the imprisoned creatures, had almost destroyed the balance that had kept peace in the subterranean domains for millennia. The god of the shadows, with his heavy and concerned gaze, knew that more than strength was needed to restore what had been lost. He would need a new plan, a new alliance. Cerberus, now more than just a mere beast, had become the new protector of the gates of the underworld. Hades, recognizing the power Cerberus possessed, knew he could not do this alone. He summoned his most loyal subordinates, including the judges of the underworld, Minos, Iacchus, and Rhadamanthus, to help restore order. Together, they discussed what could be done to correct the damage caused by the monsters' rebellion and the uncontrollable forces of Typhon. The first step was clear: to imprison once again the most dangerous creatures that had escaped before they could cause irreparable harm. However, the task would not be simple. The barriers that had imprisoned the souls and monsters of the underworld were broken, and the fear of a greater revolt was palpable. Hades knew he had to be ruthless, but he also understood that he needed to restore the trust between him and the souls that had served the underworld for centuries. For this, he found himself forced to do something he had never considered before. He would offer redemption to the souls willing to help, uniting the forces of the underworld in a common effort to recapture those who had escaped. Meanwhile, Zeus, who was slowly recovering from his defeat, also understood that he needed to regain control over Mount Olympus. He knew that although the battle against Typhon was over, the impact it had on the balance of the worlds could not be ignored. The gods had scattered, fleeing to Egypt and hiding under animal forms, and now it was time to gather forces to restore. The celestial pantheon, Hermes, the swift messenger, was sent to ensure the deities reunited, while Athena, with her strategic mind, helped organize the new celestial government. The return of Zeus and the other gods to Mount Olympus was not without challenges. The deities were deeply affected by the fear and shame of their flight before the monster Typhon. Many were reluctant to return to their positions, still shaken by the feeling of helplessness before the monstrosity that almost destroyed the world. However, with the guidance of Zeus and the example set by Athena, the gods began to realize that their strength was not in their individual power, but in the unity they shared. Only together could they restore order in Olympus and the mortal world, facing the challenges that arose every day. With Olympus back to its vigilant state and Hades finally regaining control of the underworld, the gods and the forces of the afterlife found themselves at a crossroads. The balance had been broken, but now there was a chance, a fragile opportunity to restore everything that had been lost. However, the underworld was still far from secure. Cerberus, stronger and wiser than ever, continued his watch at the gates of the realm of the dead, prepared for any new threat that might arise. Danger still lurked, but now, more than ever, both Olympus and the underworld were ready to face any force that tried to upset the balance they had sworn to protect. The return of order, though a significant step forward, was only the beginning of a new era. The balance was being restored, but in a world of myths and monsters, where the line between order and chaos could unravel at any moment, the true battle for the future was just beginning. Although Typhon had been defeated, his name would not be easily erased from history. The monster that almost destroyed the gods of Olympus and plunged the underworld into unspeakable chaos left an indelible mark. The eruptions of Mount Etna, rising from the point where he was buried, continued to spew ash and lava, reminding mortals that the monster had not been completely defeated, but merely temporarily contained. In fact, many believed that Typhon's spirit still wandered in the depths of the volcano, waiting for the right moment to rise again and resume his destruction. Typhon's children, though weaker than the monster himself, continued to be a constant threat. Mythical creatures like the Hydra of Lerna, the Nemean lion, and other horrors born of the union between Typhon and Echidna still tormented heroes and mortals alike. Stories of their battles against these beings spread across the world, feeding legends and creating fear. Each new monster, each new challenge imposed on the heroes served as a reminder of Typhon's legacy and the ability of his bloodline to bring chaos and destruction. However, future generations, both of gods and mortals, began to view Typhon's legacy differently. His children, though monstrous, were starting to become symbols of resistance and challenges to be overcome. The Hydra of Lerna, with its many heads, represented the relentless struggle against adversity. The Nemean lion, invincible and fierce, became a metaphor for courage in the face of an undefeatable enemy. Typhon, upon being defeated, had not only left destruction, but also the opportunity for his descendants to become part of the stories of overcoming adversity. For the gods, Typhon's legacy was a constant reminder that the balance between good and evil, between order and chaos, was a struggle that could never be considered won. Zeus, now re-established in his power, knew that Olympus could never afford to be complacent. The rise of Typhon and the subsequent fall of the gods had been a clear warning that, in the mythological world, any security was illusory. The gods needed to remain vigilant, always prepared for the challenges that would arise. For Typhon's legacy, with his indomitable strength and capacity to devastate, was still a latent threat. And so, the story of Typhon and his legacy continued to be told for generations, both in Olympus and among mortals. Mount Etna, with its constant eruptions, symbolized the eternal struggle against chaos. The gods and heroes that emerged after Typhon's fall were always aware that no matter how much the monster had been buried under a mountain of earth and fire, the true battle for order and peace would never end. The echo of Typhon, with his fury and destruction, would continue to reverberate throughout the world, reminding everyone that in the end, the greatest monster was not the physical being, but the chaos he represented. The end of Typhon, therefore, was not a definitive end. It was just another stage in the eternal struggle between chaos and order. And as long as Typhon's name was remembered, the fear and power of his rise would continue to inspire both terror and courage in the hearts of all who lived under the shadow of mythology. So, what did you think of this incredible story about Typhon's rise and fall? The legacy of this monster and the impact he had on Greek mythology is truly fascinating, right? Now, I want to know your thoughts. Leave a comment below telling me what you think of this whole storyline, and if you have any theories or curiosities about mythological legends. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow and bring more content like this. And if you haven't subscribed yet, take a moment to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any new videos. Let's continue exploring these epic stories together and diving into the fantastic world of mythology. Until next time, and remember, chaos may always be lurking, but it's our courage that defines our destiny.